About the year 800, a series of brutal attacks shattered a century of peace in Britain. The Vikings had arrived. The reasons for their coming lay in Scandinavia, home of the Viking raiders.
Had the London Times been out on the morning of June the 9th, 793, the headlines would have been, "Heathen men ravage Lindisfarne. The Northumbrian monastery is plundered. Monks reported killed by Viking Scandinavians." The Vikings were to dominate life in Europe and Britain for the next 200 years. Who were these previously unknown Norsemen? Why did they suddenly become so important? And what accounts for their spectacular raids on Britain? The Vikings were the Norwegians, Danes and Swedes, inhabitants of what we now know as Scandinavia. They shared a common culture and language in their homelands, and almost overnight they changed from a little-known people into traders and raiders, lords and settlers whose reach extended from America to Asia in two great ages of expansion known as the Viking Ages. I have been much tempted to rely on the vivid descriptions of bloodthirsty, beer-drinking Norsemen from literary sources of the time, but the reality is much more complicated than this, and I have chosen instead to look deeper. In the Viking Ages, Scandinavia played a crucial role in the world economy. This had dramatic repercussions on the Nordic countries, and these effects can only be explained in terms of what kind of society there was to be found in Scandinavia at the time. So, first let us look at the economic factors. The first Viking Age, and that is from about 800 to 950, was a period of trade expansion, then raid, then trade again. Previously a backwater, in the period around 800, Scandinavia found itself at one end of the world economic trading system that stretched all the way from China. This led to a massive injection of cash into the economies of Scandinavia. Sometime in the 780s, a regular trade route was set up, for the first time linking Scandinavia and the Middle East. Vikings, bearing furs, iron weapons and slaves, traveled by boat along the broad, easily navigated rivers of central Russia, the Dnieper and, most important, the Volga, to the trading cities at the river mouths, such as Itil on the Caspian. There they met Jewish and Muslim traders from the Middle East, who were in turn opening up trade via Tehran, the gateway to India, China, and the Far East. There were two routes, by sea through the Persian Gulf and overland by the old Silk Route. Islamic silver flowed through Russia into Scandinavia and from there into Western Europe. The petty Scandinavian courts also received exotic goods such as silk and peacocks from these distant lands along the trade routes, as did other rulers. Harun al-Rashid, for example, the famous Caliph of Baghdad of the Arabian Nights, sent an elephant to Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor. The poor animal actually died of flu when it was brought north to participate in fighting against the Danes. And thus, in a short time, the Norsemen became actively engaged in the world around them, mainly through trade. Incidents like the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 were still rare. However, this international trade network collapsed in the second quarter of the 9th century due to warring in Russia and the Near East. Communication was no longer possible, and this had a profound effect on Viking society. The kings and upper classes had acquired new standards of living and had expanded their political and military power. Now this power of the lords was threatened. To secure their position, they turned to raiding in the hope that plunder would replace trade as source of income, and hence the raids of the later 9th century. We now meet the loathed Danes of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, gangs or armies moving around quickly, much like commandos in their superb longships. These crafts could enter even small rivers and withstand high waves on the open sea. The Viking longship was very fast, whether under sail or when being rowed by its crew of some 40 men. With the mast, prow, and stern lowered, the ship was easy to hide, yet it could move out instantly. Viking armies, led by warrior kings, roamed abroad for years at a time. This resulted in the political domination of large parts of England and France by the Vikings. Normandy, for instance, was given to the Vikings as a fief. With political domination came large-scale settlement, first by the armies, later by other groups of Scandinavians, because, with the wealth of the period around 800 gone, expectations and ambitions could no longer be satisfied within Scandinavia. However, the Vikings quickly went native and were easily absorbed into the local culture. Even differences in religious beliefs do not seem to have mattered much. The pagan Vikings simply turned Christian. For example, we can see from this mold that a Viking smith was casting both Christian crosses and a pagan hammer symbol at the same time. The Danes were not the only people to move out of Scandinavia under the pressure of social and economic circumstances. At the beginning of the Viking Age, the Norwegians had already landed in Scotland, where they established themselves on the Northern Isles and the Hebrides. Within a few years, the Vikings seized the Faroe Islands and Iceland, and at the very end of the Viking Age, they colonized Greenland. A few bold explorers extended the boundaries of the known world when they reached the coast of North America and founded a short-lived settlement here at Lazo Meadows, Newfoundland. Viking ship technology and seamanship improved as wide stretches of open sea were crossed. Ironically, the main body of settlers in the North Atlantic may well have been Celtic slaves under their Norwegian masters. This shows how careful we must be not to confuse Scandinavian lordship with pure Scandinavian settlement. To sum up at this point, we have two Viking ages, each characterized by a wave of Scandinavian attacks on Britain. In the first Viking Age, 800 to 950, the raids were freelance operations which rose to a peak between 860 and 890, followed by settlement. The raids on the west were a response to failing trade. When the Scandinavians were able to reopen the route to the Near East after 890, the raids died away rapidly, ceasing entirely by 950. Why did this happen? The key to the whole system is the Sassanid Empire in Central Asia. Based around the fabled cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in Turkestan in Central Asia. This dynasty occupied a position at the very crossroads of international trade between Europe and the Far East. Large amounts of Islamic silver, now from Afghanistan and Turkestan, once again flowed into Scandinavia. Some Islamic merchant and diplomatic missions reached as far as the Middle Volga, where they came into contact with Viking traders in slaves and furs. Some of the Viking traders traveled as far as Baghdad. However, also this prosperity was short-lived. In the period around 950, the Sassanids had lost control of all important trade routes, and so the second wave of eastern trade collapsed. This had far-reaching consequences in Scandinavia. The major trading port at Birka, located here near present-day Stockholm, which was highly dependent on the trade with Russia and the East, crumbled and never rose again. This paralleled the crisis of the first Viking Age, but this time, in the second Viking Age from 950 to 1050, we do not see the same response. The collapse of trade did not at once give way to raid. In fact, it was some time before raids began. That was in the period around 990 to 1000, and when they did, it was on a different scale entirely. These were huge affairs conducted by a large naval force under a strong king. The raiders exacted such severe tribute that it was cheaper for the English to accept a Danish king and pay taxes, and to remain independent and pay tribute. Denmark is the most important Viking nation at this time. It expands not only to conquer England, but also at the expense of its neighbors, Norway and Sweden. But why this difference between the first and the second Viking Age? It is to explain this that we must turn to look at the nature of Viking society itself and the changes that took place, in particular in Danish society, between the first and the second Viking Age. In the first Viking Age and earlier, Denmark was covered by villages and hamlets with streets and greens. The farms were large and situated on spacious square crofts surrounded by palisade fences. These compounds reflect a well-organized society with individual control of cattle and other resources. On the political level, this society was made up of petty rural kingdoms, as were its Scandinavian neighbors who shared language and culture with the Danes. The farmers and rulers were also warriors, and only in times of war did powerful kings emerge. Trade enriched the nobility, the magnates, but for most people life went on much as usual. The arts, or at least those of the aristocracy, were highly abstract or ornamental, almost completely lacking in content. The society was pagan, which meant believes in a number of gods whose behavior resembled an idealized version of the life of the magnates, traveling, feasting, and seeking excitement. In the 9th century, there were only a couple of towns in Denmark situated at the border and on the North Sea. These towns were not provincial centers, but geared to the international trade. They were, in other words, marketplaces rather than normal towns. Significantly, men made up by far the largest part of the population, to judge from the sizes of the many shoes found and the skeletons in the burial yards. The best-known town is Hedeby, near present-day Slesvig. Hedeby was connected with Birka, near Stockholm in Sweden, Birka with trading centers in Russia, and so on. But in the second Viking Age, from 950 to 1050, a new type of society emerged in Denmark. A centralized state with many town centers, taxation of various kinds, strong kings, and large armies. There were two reasons for this. First, there were long-term changes in the system of agriculture. Secondly, there was northward pressure from Germany that gave a stimulus to one royal family, the Jelling dynasty in Jutland, to broaden its power and extend its defenses. How did this come about? The economic basis for this new kind of state lay in the developments that had taken place in agriculture. The leading echelons of Danish society showed a strong interest in cereal agriculture in the second Viking Age. In the earlier days, herding was a dominant kind of farming, but now there was an increase in the cultivation of cereal crops, accompanied by the introduction of new and more sturdy types of plough. People settled down in stable agricultural communities, but they held their land as private property and established a settlement pattern that has lasted until the present day. In the second Viking Age, we also see a novel type of farm in Denmark, the magnet farm, or rather the manor. One such magnet farm was found at Vorbasse in central Jutland. In the middle of the manor was a splendid hall, rivaled only by those of the royal fortresses. The hall was the living quarters of a landlord. At the periphery of the croft were stables with rooms for about 100 large animals, storerooms, other living quarters for servants, workshops, and so on. Such farmsteads clearly tell us how, in the late Viking Age, wealth in land was amassed on a scale not known before. We can see here the economic basis for the strong aristocracy and the great rulers of the Second Viking Age, such as Canute, the Danish and English king of the early 11th century. This fundamental change in agricultural practice had the result that Denmark could feed a very large population. There was no serious attempt to expand settling abroad in the Second Viking Age. On the contrary, the new types of agriculture and settlement became the basis for the state of Denmark, the society that developed from the earlier petty kingdoms in the country. The Danish state was founded in Jutland, nearest to both England and an expanding Germany. At the royal centre of Jelling, King Harald had erected a huge stone around 960 in memory of his parents and to underline his own newly acquired position and power. The runic inscription on the stone reads, "King Harald bade be made this monument after Gorm his father, and Thyra his mother, that Harald who won for himself Denmark all and Norway, and made the Danes Christian." King Harald was acknowledged as a supreme lord in Norway as well as in Denmark. He also accepted Christianity as a state religion, a move to identify his state with the West European societies and to keep the German emperor at bay. A few years earlier, the emperor had nominated German bishops to convert the pagan Danes and moved to seize Jutland as a German fief. But now that Denmark was officially Christian, the emperor lost any such pretext for trying to establish a foothold on Danish soil. The core of King Harald's realm in Denmark was secured with fortifications. To the south, the ancient border walls were reinforced. To the north and east, he bade be made magnificent circular fortresses of the famous Trelleborg type, modelled on a symmetrical plan and containing large halls. In the core area of the country, we find the earliest Danish provincial towns. The towns were still very small by our standards, but they occupied a crucial position in a new type of economy. They acted as markets for produce from the surrounding areas and centers for increased craft production. Towns also housed the most important church institutions like the cathedrals and royal representatives. The development in Denmark in the Second Viking Age was very costly for the state. The military sector alone, including ships, fortifications, the Trelleborg fortresses and so on, would easily have eaten up a traditional royal revenue. In addition, the state also developed what we today would call the infrastructure of the country. Roads were improved and very large bridges built. In order to pay for all this, the state of Denmark, based in Jutland, began to look for new sources of income. The process started by extending control over the minor kingdoms of eastern Denmark. By the year 1000, the eastern provinces of Denmark were fully integrated into the kingdom and its new order with towns and markets, bishoprics and so on. Norway, and especially Sweden, seemed to have been far less developed in this period. This prompted a rivalry between the Nordic nations, which formed the background to the new wave of Scandinavian attacks on England in the Second Viking Age. In the 980s, Scandinavian pirates, first Norwegians, returned to the coast of England for booty. In 994, the Danish king Sven, son of King Harald, led a direct assault on England. A few years earlier, for the first time, the Vikings exacted tribute payment instead of raiding or settlement. In return for tribute, the Vikings promised peace and safety. The first tribute paid was only £10,000 of silver in 991. This sum, however, was only a fraction of the total payment to the Danes in this period. All in all, almost £250,000 of silver were paid by the English in increasingly larger amounts from 991 to 1018. It is no wonder that Sven and later his son, the famous Canute, were elected English kings. It was cheaper to pay them taxation than tribute. There is another important difference. The money from the raids in the first Viking Age was spent abroad, but now the money was fed back into the Danish economy. The income of King Sven and King Canute resulted in a doubling of the silver stock in Denmark, but other Scandinavian countries also benefited. The Danish kings bought the support of a large number of Scandinavian leaders and their warriors for the conquest of England with the promise of booty. King Canute, seen here in an English picture, and his son managed to rule a North Sea empire centered on England and Denmark, but only, and with interruptions, until 1042, when the English freed themselves from Danish rule and the empire collapsed.